Imagine waking up one morning in 2027 and realizing the dollars in your bank account have silently been rewritten by history. Your balance still shows the same number, but what those numbers buy has changed forever. Your mortgage evaporated, your savings were gutted, and the people who knew what was coming, people who positioned themselves years earlier, just became 5, 10, even 20 times wealthier overnight. That's not science fiction. It's what already happened in 1933. It's what already happened in 1971. And some believe it's exactly what's coming next. This is Trump's plan to bring back the gold standard, the hidden 2027 reset. Act 1, the words everyone ignored. In early 2023, Donald Trump made a remark that for most people floated by like any other political line. But for people watching gold, currencies, and global power shifts, it sounded like a signal flare. He said, in essence, we used to have real money, gold. Now we have paper backed by nothing. And that will change. Then on the campaign trail in 2024, he leaned into the same theme. On day one, I will restore sound money to America. The dollar will be strong again, backed by something real. To the average voter, it sounded like nostalgia, a nice punchline for a rally. To people who understand monetary history, it sounded like a trial balloon. Because the one thing you have to understand about Trump is this: he often tests ideas in public before anyone realizes they're not off the cuff, they're signals. Who was Trump talking to with those comments? Not just the crowd in front of him. He was talking to central banks accumulating gold quietly in the background, BRICS nations openly discussing alternatives to the dollar, and a small group of advisors around him who have all, in one way or another, flirted with the idea of returning to gold-backed money. Judy Shelton has written about a modern gold standard and sound money. Robert Lighthizer has warned that the current system benefits China. Voices like Steve Bannon have framed money itself as a national security issue. Together, they form a pattern. And when you add that pattern to the long cycles of monetary history, suddenly 2027 stops looking like a random year. It starts to look like a deadline. Act 2, the gold standard. What it was and why it really ended. Before we talk about Trump 2027 and a possible reset, we need to rewind. Because for most of modern American history, people didn't argue about what a dollar was. They knew. For decades, a dollar was literally a claim on a fixed amount of gold. From 1879 to 1933, the United States operated on what's often called the classical gold standard, 1 ounce of gold in 2067. Your paper dollars weren't abstract, they were receipts. At any bank, you could hand over a $20 bill and walk out with roughly an ounce of physical gold. That system did one incredibly important thing. It put a chain around the government's ankle. You couldn't print more paper claims than you had gold in the vault. If politicians wanted to spend more to build programs, fund wars, or stimulate the economy, they had a problem, and they were constrained by reality. For ordinary people, that meant long-term price stability savings that held value over decades, a government that couldn't easily inflate its way out of bad decisions. For politicians and central bankers during a crisis, it meant a wall, and walls in crisis tend to get smashed. Roosevelt's shock, 1933. By 1933, the Great Depression had the American economy on life support. Banks were failing. Unemployment was soaring. Fear became the national currency. Franklin D. Roosevelt decided that to reflate the system, to save the economy, he needed the one thing the gold standard denied him: the ability to create money in bulk. But as long as citizens could turn dollars into gold on demand, the government's hands were tied. So Roosevelt did something unprecedented in modern American history. He used emergency powers. He ordered Americans to turn in their gold, coins, bullion, and certain certificates. He fixed the government's purchase price at a specific rate. And once the gold was in government hands, he changed the rules. After the gold was collected, the official price of gold was revalued higher in dollar terms. Gold went up, the dollar went down. The people who had obeyed and handed over their gold were paid at the old price. The government now owned gold valued at the new price. It was a wealth transfer executed with a signature. Not a market move, not a vote. A decree. That moment taught the world two things. Governments will change the rules of money when cornered gold is the fulcrum they like to move Bretton Woods and Nixon, 1944-1971. After World War II, the US didn't return to the old classical gold standard. Instead, it moved to a hybrid system, Bretton Woods. Here's how that worked. Foreign governments, not regular citizens, could redeem dollars for gold. The US promised to convert foreign dollars into gold at a fixed rate, $35 per ounce. The dollar became the center of the global monetary system. Other countries pegged their currencies to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold. This made the dollar the world's reserve currency, but there was a catch, and that catch was human nature. Once again, the US government discovered that being tied to gold was inconvenient. It wanted to spend more than it took in, on domestic programs, on wars, on politics. So it printed more dollars. For years, this worked, until it didn't. By the late 1960s, foreign governments started to notice that America had printed far more dollar claims than it had gold to satisfy them. Some countries began to say, "We like the gold, please, not the promises." Gold flowed out of US reserves. On August 15th, 1971, facing a run on America's gold, President Richard Nixon went on television and announced something that changed everything. The US would suspend the dollar's convertibility into gold. The door was shut. The world woke up the next day in a completely new monetary system. The dollar was no longer backed by gold at all. From that moment on, the dollar became a pure fiat currency, money by decree, backed not by metal, but by confidence and force. And once that constraint was gone, something predictable happened. The money supply exploded, debt soared. The purchasing power of the dollar eroded. Slowly at first, then faster. Look around you today. Prices, wages, savings, debt. All of it is downstream of that decision in 1971. In 1933, the government changed the rules to give itself room to inflate. In 1971, it removed the guardrails completely. Now the clock is ticking toward the next reset. Act 3. The dollar in crisis. To understand why some people think 2027 is reset time, you have to look not at campaign slogans, but at numbers. Because while politicians give speeches, math doesn't. Right now, the dollar's dominance rests on three pillars. Reserve currency status. Central banks around the world hold dollars as their main reserve asset. Petrodollar system. Oil, the lifeblood of modern economies, has been priced largely in dollars for decades. US military and financial power. The US can enforce, directly or indirectly, the continued use of its currency. All three pillars are under strain. Central banks have been quietly diversifying their reserves away from dollars and into gold and other currencies. Major economies are exploring alternatives to dollar-based payment systems. And critically, US debt has exploded to levels that would have been unthinkable just a generation ago. The US federal government owes tens of trillions of dollars. Add in unfunded promises and global debt, and the numbers become abstract, too large for most people to really grasp. But you don't have to understand every digit. You only need to understand this. The current system assumes that the world will keep buying US debt, inflation will remain managed, the dollar will stay trusted enough that people accept being paid back in it. If any of those assumptions crack, the system shakes. What happens when foreign creditors start to question whether they'll be repaid in real value? Oil producers accept other currencies? Blocks of countries start building their own financial plumbing? We're starting to find out. BRICS nations are openly exploring gold-linked or commodity-linked alternatives. Central banks are buying gold at a pace not seen in decades. Major economies have been sanctioned, shut out of dollar systems, and have responded by asking, "What's our plan B?" At the same time, inside the US, interest payments on the national debt are consuming larger and larger slices of the budget. It's like someone who has maxed out all their credit cards and is now borrowing more just to cover the monthly interest. That kind of system doesn't glide gently to a stop. It resets. The question isn't if, it's how and who controls it. That's where Trump and 2027 come in.
Act 4, the 50 to 100-year pattern. If you zoom out, big monetary resets don't happen every year. They happen roughly every half-century or so. 1879 to 1933, classical gold standard era 1933 to 1944, transition, gold confiscation, revaluation 1944 to 1971. Bretton Woods, dollar-gold link for foreign governments, 1971 present, fiat dollar era roughly every 40 to 50 years. The system hits a breaking point. Too much debt, too many promises, too many claims on a limited base of real assets. When that happens, there are only two choices. Default, honestly say. We can't pay what we owe. Default, dishonestly change the unit of account. Pay back in devalued money. Leaders almost always choose option number 2. They don't say, we're defaulting. They say, we're modernizing the system. We're restoring stability. We're making our money sound again. The result is the same. Anyone holding paper claims gets diluted. Now notice the timing. From the classical gold standard peak to Roosevelt's reset, about 50 years. From Roosevelt's reset to Nixon closing the gold window, about 40 years. From Nixon's shock in 1971 to the mid-2020s, over 50 years. In other words, we are right on schedule. Monetary historians talk about long waves and debt supercycles. You don't need those terms. You just need to understand that debt accumulates. Politicians kick the can down the road eventually. The can reaches the end of the road when that happens. You don't get no system. You get a new system. The people who understand the pattern can prepare. The people who don't become the fuel for the reset. Act 5, Trump's second term, the 2027 window. So how does Trump specifically fit into this? Let's assume a scenario where Trump takes office in January 2025 with a second term. That gives him 4 years to reshape economic policy, a looming debt and currency crisis, rising pressure from BRICS and alternative systems, and crucially, no need to run for re-election afterward. In American politics, the most controversial moves often happen in the middle of a second term. Year 1, appointments, immediate crises, consolidating power, years 2 to 3. The window for bold, risky, legacy-defining actions, year 4, managing fallout, shoring up allies, planning exits. Now overlay that with a hypothetical. BRICS accelerates its plans for a gold or commodity-linked currency around 2025-2026. U.S. debt keeps rising, interest costs become suffocating, confidence in the dollar wobbles. But doesn't fully collapse yet. 2027 sits in the middle of Trump's second term. It sits in the middle of a long-term monetary pattern, and it sits in a window where a drastic reset could be framed as emergency national security policy, executed quickly, then managed politically before the term ends. Would Trump, a man obsessed with legacy and disruption, be tempted to rewrite the monetary system and stamp his name on the biggest reset since Nixon? That's the scenario this script explores. Again, this is not a prediction. It's a plausible playbook based on history, incentives, and patterns. So how would it actually work? Act 6, the 5-step reset playbook. If a Trump administration decided to move toward a gold-linked dollar in 2027, it wouldn't be done with a single speech. It would likely follow a sequence. Step 1, declare a national economic emergency. You can't rewrite the foundations of money quietly. You need legal authority, political cover, a narrative that frames opposition as dangerous or unpatriotic. Imagine a scenario like this. The administration goes on television and says, China, BRICS, and hostile powers are actively working to undermine the dollar and destroy American prosperity. Our debt-based fiat system is being weaponized against us. This is an economic war, and in war, we must act. Under existing emergency powers, laws, the president can take sweeping control over financial flows, gold, and foreign exchange. The move is framed not as a technical monetary tweak, but as national defense. Once the public accepts that framing, everything that follows becomes easier to justify. Step 2, restrict gold ownership. Does a modern reset have to look exactly like 1933? No. But the logic is similar. If you want to back a currency with gold and you don't want to buy that gold at sky-high market prices, you either need to confiscate, restrict, or heavily tax private holdings. One possible approach: allow each citizen to hold a limited amount of gold, say a few ounces. Anything above that must be sold to the Treasury at a fixed exchange rate. Require reporting of large gold holdings via banks, dealers, and custodians. Threaten penalties for non-compliance under emergency powers. This wouldn't be marketed as "we're seizing your property." It would be sold as "we are transitioning to a stronger dollar. We must consolidate national gold reserves for the good of the country." You'll be fairly compensated at market prices, but as history shows, the real trick comes after the gold is in government hands. Step 3. Revalue gold upward. Devalue the dollar once the government has centralized a large chunk of gold, declared an emergency, prepared the public for big changes to restore sound money. It can do what Roosevelt did in the 1930s, and what every reset does in some form: change the conversion rate. Today, the U.S. officially holds a large amount of gold in its reserves. At current market prices, that gold is worth hundreds of billions of dollars. But the total money supply runs into the tens of trillions. That means, at today's gold price, you can't meaningfully back the currency to back even a fraction of the money supply. You either need a lot more gold or a much higher gold price. What happens if the government declares effective immediately? Gold is officially valued at $10,000 or $20,000 per ounce for monetary purposes. In an instant, the value of the government's gold reserves explodes in dollar terms. Gold held by those who manage to keep it, or foreign nations, is massively revalued. The real value of each dollar drops because it now converts into less gold than before. This is a wealth transfer mechanism. Gold and real assets jump. Cash and bonds, which are denominated in the old unit, get diluted. It's not a glitch, it's the point. Step 4. Inflate away the debt. Here's the hidden heart of a reset. It's not just about sound money, it's about unpayable promises. If the U.S. government owes enormous sums in dollar terms, there are only a few ways out. Cut spending dramatically and raise taxes politically, almost impossible. Default, openly catastrophic for credibility, or change what a dollar means. In real terms, when you devalue a currency substantially, existing debts are still paid back in nominal terms, but the true purchasing power of those payments collapses. For example, if the dollar's real value is cut by 80 to 90%, the real weight of the debt falls by 80 to 90%. Creditors, foreign governments, pension funds, bondholders take the hit. The debtor, the U.S. government, escapes much of the burden. This is why resets are often framed as necessary, inevitable, or for the public good. They're the only politically viable way to escape a mountain of obligations without explicitly declaring bankruptcy. Trump, or any leader in that position, might present it as, "We are restructuring our monetary system to ensure America can honor its commitments in a strong, sound currency. We refuse to be slaves to debt created under a broken system." In reality, it's a partial stealth default, paid in full, in a much weaker unit. Step 5. Announce a new gold-linked dollar. After the emergency, restrictions, and revaluation comes the grand reveal: a new system, something like a dollar, officially linked to gold at a high fixed rate. Gold convertibility for foreign governments or institutions under strict conditions. Domestic convertibility, either limited or prohibited ongoing use of dollars for international trade, especially energy, stationery, commodities, and strategic goods. On paper, this looks like a return to sound money. In practice, it could resemble Bretton Woods 2.0, enough gold linkage to restore confidence, enough control to allow future adjustments if needed, enough complexity that ordinary citizens never fully grasped the mechanics. Markets would whipsaw. Gold prices would spike, drop, then settle at the new official level. Currencies around the world would scramble to adjust. Countries would scramble to decide whether to align with the new dollar system or alternative blocks. By the end of the process, you'd have a gold-linked dollar debts effectively sliced down in real terms. A restructured global hierarchy of winners and losers, all accomplished not by a vote of the people, but by the quiet math of revaluation. Act 7. Winners and losers in the 2027 reset. If something like this were to happen, who comes out ahead? Likely winners: 1. Holders of physical gold who keep it. If gold is revalued dramatically higher, Each ounce becomes far more valuable in dollar terms. People who acquired gold before the reset see large gains, however. If ownership is heavily restricted or partially confiscated, those gains could be capped for compliant citizens. People who manage to hold gold legally outside restrictive jurisdictions, or who bought early and moved some holdings abroad, may preserve more upside. 2. Gold-producing countries and miners nations with large gold reserves, active mining industries, or both, suddenly see their economic power multiplied. Gold miners, whose resources in the ground are now valued at much higher prices, can experience enormous valuation shifts. 3. Owners of real assets financed with fixed-rate debt. If you own a house, farmland, a productive business, financed with long-term fixed-rate debt, and the currency is sharply devalued, something interesting happens. The nominal amount you owe doesn't change, but the real cost of that debt collapses. Your mortgage or loan repayment is made in weaker dollars. Your real asset adjusts upward in nominal price. In real terms, your debt is effectively shrunk. 4. Strategic states that align early countries that position themselves with significant gold reserves negotiate favorable terms with a new gold-linked dollar or alternative bloc. Move early to adjust their financial systems. Could gain influence in the new order. Those who wait and hope the old system continues may find themselves trapped. Likely losers 1. Cash holders and dollar savers. If you hold large cash balances, checking or savings accounts, certificates of deposit, your nominal numbers stay the same. But if the currency is sharply devalued, what those numbers buy craters. The illusion of safety, I'm in cash, so I'm safe, turns out to be exactly that, an illusion. 2. Bondholders and pension funds. Bonds are promises to pay fixed amounts of currency in the future. If the currency is devalued, those fixed payments lose much of their real value. Long-term bonds get hit hardest. Institutions like pension funds and insurers find themselves underwater. Retirees who expected a certain standard of living from those fixed payments now face a harsh reality. The money comes, but it doesn't stretch. 3. Foreign creditors to the U.S. countries that hold large amounts of U.S. Treasury bonds or dollar assets would be repaid in a weaker unit. Formally, there's no default. In substance, they took a massive hit. Decades of trade surpluses, stored in dollar promises, would be quietly eroded. For middle-class savers concentrated in paper assets, the average middle-class person in developed countries tends to store wealth in cash bonds. Retirement accounts, heavily weighted toward paper claims. If those claims are denominated in a currency that gets heavily devalued, and if the adjustment is rapid, they don't have the time or the knowledge to reposition. They wake up in a world where their nominal balances look similar. Their true buying power does not. That is how a reset hollows out the middle. Act 8. Geopolitics. Dollar versus BRICS. The Monetary Cold War. This isn't just a story about Trump or American debt. It's a story about who controls the scoreboard of global wealth. For nearly a century, that scoreboard has been denominated in dollars. Trade is largely invoiced in dollars. Commodities, especially oil, are priced in dollars. Global reserves are held primarily in dollar assets. That system has allowed the U.S. to run persistent trade deficits. Export inflation finance, massive deficits at relatively low cost, but every advantage creates a countermove. BRICS nations and others are building alternative payment rails, negotiating direct currency swaps, increasing their gold reserves, signaling interest in commodity-backed or gold-linked arrangements. The game is simple. If the dollar remains pure fiat, while others move toward harder anchors, trust in the dollar erodes faster. If the U.S. preemptively returns to some form of gold backing, it may slow or reverse that erosion. A Trump-led reset could be framed as, we are taking back monetary leadership. We will have the strongest currency on earth again. Not backed by empty promises, but by real value. From that plea, you'd likely see the world split more clearly. A dollar zone, anchored by a restructured, gold-linked U.S. currency, a BRICS alternative zone, with its own commodity or gold-linked units. Each side would compete for trade partners, offer financing and security, wage not just military or cyber wars, but currency wars. Every country on earth would quietly ask itself, which side do we trust more? With our savings, our trade, and our future. Act 9. What can ordinary people do? Not advice, just patterns. Nothing in this script is financial advice. It's an exploration of patterns. In past resets, the people who came through best shared a few traits. They didn't assume the current system would last forever. They held some form of hard assets. They minimized dependence on fixed paper claims. They diversified geography, currency, and counterparty risk historically. Strategies that have helped people navigate currency resets include holding physical gold or silver as long-term insurance within legal limits and respecting risk owning real assets, land productive businesses, skills that generate value regardless of currency. Avoiding overexposure to long-term fixed income promises in a potentially devaluing unit, keeping modest reserves of essentials food, water, medicine for short-term disruptions, diversifying across jurisdictions, not all wealth in one country, one currency, or one system in 1933 and 1971. The people who clung to the old rules of money suffered the most. The people who understood that the rules themselves were changing had a chance to adapt. Whether 2027 brings a Trump-led gold reset, a BRIC-centered alternative, or a different kind of monetary upheaval altogether. The underlying lesson is the same. Systems change, math wins, and those who prepare mentally and structurally tend to fare better than those who simply hope everything will be fine. Act 10, the 2027 question. So, will Trump absolutely definitely bring back the gold standard in 2027? No one can say that with certainty. What we can say is, the current fiat system is stretched historically thin debt. Deficits and global imbalances are at extremes. Rivals are openly building alternatives to the dollar. Gold is quietly returning to center stage in central bank reserves. The long cycle timing lines up eerily well with the mid-2020s Trump has. The personality profile of someone who likes big, dramatic moves, advisors who have spoken favorably about gold and sound money. A potential second-term window where political risk-taking is highest combine those factors. And a 2027 reset stops looking like a wild fantasy and starts looking like one plausible path among several. Maybe it happens, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's Trump. Maybe it's another leader, or another crisis, or another trigger. But the deeper truth is independent of any single person. No monetary system based on ever-expanding debt and unconstrained printing has lasted forever. Every such system has ended in one of two ways: a chaotic collapse that blindsides everyone, or a managed reset that rewrites the rules over a few turbulent years. We are approaching that fork. Trump might be the face at the podium when it happens, or he might simply be one of many players in a larger historical script. Either way, the clock is ticking. The question isn't really, will Trump bring back the gold standard in 2027? The real question is, what happens when a system built on infinite promises finally runs into finite reality, and how will you be positioned when it does? Because history is clear on one thing: resets create victims, resets create winners, and the difference between the two often comes down to one simple factor: whether you saw the pattern in time or only understood it after the reset had already begun.